Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction to dynamic topology sculpting from blendercookie.com. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and today I'm going to give you an introduction to what dynamic topology is, how we use it, and how it affects our sculpting workflow inside Blender. To get started, let's first talk about more traditional digital sculpting methods within Blender and other applications to better understand how dynamic topology is going to change this workflow. So most sculpting systems rely on a subdivided mesh with enough density such that when you sculpt on your surface, it has the geometry there to represent the detail that you're adding in. So for example, if I were sculpting on this cube here, this is just a default cube, so you can see it just has the normal polygon count. And if I go in and add a multi-resolution modifier, I can then increase the resolution of this mesh with each additional level of subdivision. And as I add more and more levels of subdivision, I have the ability to add in more and more detail. So this is the way that most sculpting systems work, and the way that sculpting in Blender has always worked ever since we first got it. This is a great system. It works well. It allows us to add in a lot of detail, and it leaves us with a nice workable mesh. And one other benefit to this system is that it allows us to add additional geometry on top of, say, a animation-ready character. So you can take your optimized model, that's ready for animation, and you can add basically a detail pass on it using multi-resolution. And since it's interpolating all of the detail based on the subdivisions that you add in, then it has a really nice clean mesh. It plays nice with armatures, it plays nice with deformations, and other things like that. However, a multi-resolution system like this has a severe limitation when it comes to kind of conceptual sculpting, in that it is limited by the mesh that you start with. So for example, in this case, I started with a cube as my base mesh, as it's known. And this is all fine and dandy, but if I decide that I want to sculpt, say, I want to put on some horns like this, or well, that's not quite a horn, let's try that again. So I want to put on a horn like that, or maybe I want to put a limb right here. Then anything that I want to do in that regards of adding any kind of appendage or extensions or anything that dramatically alters the original shape is going to be very, very difficult to do, because what's going to happen is we're going to dramatically stretch out the mesh. So if I just use the grab brush here and I just pull this out, you can immediately see that our polygons in here have become very, very stretched. And this becomes problematic because now if I want to go in, just say use the draw brush, add in detail right there, you can immediately see what happens. That geometry has become very, very stretched, and I'm not able to add in that detail unless I dramatically increase the numbers of subdivisions. But since this has become stretched, this is now square and very, evenly distributed. So I can still add in detail all that I want down here, but adding it in here is still problematic, and we end up with things like this. So this is where the multi-resolution system begins to fall short, is anytime that you want to go beyond the scope of your original form. So anytime that you're doing, say, conceptual sculpting, where you're going in and maybe you're basically sketching, or you're designing a character and you want to have a lot of freedom with the form to, if you want to add in new limbs, you want to add in horns, you want to, add in nice crisp lines, you don't have a lot of that flexibility. So multi-resolution is very good for doing a detail pass, but it is not good for the actual form creation. And this is where dynamic topology comes in. So let me just remove the multi-resolution modifier. We're going to go back to our original cube. And now inside the sculpting system, if you look over here on the left side in our toolbar, we have a topology tab. And if we just click enable dynamic, this then enables the dynamic topology within our mesh. And what dynamic topology allows us to do is to dynamically tessellate the mesh under our surface to accommodate for the detail that we're trying to add in. So for example, notice that my cube, which is just, 8 points, is now triangulated. So this is one thing with dynamic topology, is that it triangulates everything, but that's okay. So we have a very, very limited geometry. We have a total of 8 vertices and 12 triangles. But if I now go in and I just use my draw brush and I sculpt over right like this, you can see it's immediately adding in that geometry to account for the detail. If we take a look at this now, we can see that I now have 1,153 vertices with 2,302 faces. And so it has dynamically tessellated the mesh underneath my brush in order to account for that detail. So I can do things like if I say use the clay strips brush and I just hold down Control, drag across this corner, I can start cutting it in. I can cut in through here. I can add more surface. And so we have a lot of flexibility to then begin creating not only detail within our existing form, but we have the ability to create new forms entirely. And this is one thing that you really cannot do with the multi-resolution system when relying on an existing model that you're sculpting on. So this becomes very, very powerful for any kind of conceptual sculpting or perhaps for the original form. One of the benefits of sculpting is that it is a very organic and kind of creative workflow, whereas polymodeling is much more technical. And so having this additional freedom within our sculpting workflow is very, very beneficial, particularly to artists, because it gives us more freedom to kind of explore what we want to do. So let's look a little bit more at what dynamic topology is doing and how we can make use of it. So you know that it is now dynamically tessellating the mesh underneath the surface. And if we go into edit mode, we can see that it has actually created that exact mesh. So this is not a layer system. It's not adding it as a modifier on top of the mesh. It's actually modifying the mesh. And this is something that's really important to understand because the dynamic topology is both a creation process, but it's also a destructive process. And that means that if you have any kind of UV coordinates, vertex colors, or anything like that that is attached to your mesh, it will destroy those when you begin sculpting with your dynamic topology. So this is something that you probably want to be aware of from the get-go, is that dynamic topology is much more of a creative process, not a polished process. So if you're going in and you've already got your character completely designed and created, you've got a nice final model, and you just want to add a little detail to it, you'll use the multi-resolution system generally. If instead you are looking to sculpt your character for the very first time, you're creating it, you're exploring the different routes, then you may use dynamic topology. So they're both different systems, but they also play nice together from time to time and can be adapted into different workflows. And it'll be largely up to you to figure out what that workflow is, because there's limitations to both. So first of all, let's go back to our mesh and again look at the dynamic topology and see how the sculpting is going. So you notice that when I tabbed into edit mode, my enable dynamic has now been turned off. So it's turned off the dynamic topology. And this is just something that happens. I can't tell exactly why, but I'm sure that there's good reasons behind it. But basically, anytime that you leave sculpt mode with dynamic topology on, it'll turn dynamic topology off. So if I just turn this back on, then I have access to my dynamic topology settings once more. Let's go ahead and look at those settings. So first of all, we have the detail size, which is set to 30. And this detail size is based on pixels of your screen. So if you look at the tooltip here, you can see it's the maximum edge length for dynamic topology sculpting in pixels. So in other words, when I sculpt right here, these edges that it's creating, you can see like an edge right here, an edge here, 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 etc. These are all a maximum of 30 pixels long. I believe that's accurate. And so the smaller this size here, the smaller the edges will be when you sculpt them. So if I turn this way down, say like 9, and I sculpt in here, you notice that the edges are much, much smaller, and I have the capacity to create much finer detail. But of course, with finer detail and higher resolution geometry comes more memory requirements. So this just allows you to adjust the detail based on your needs. So if I'm sculpting a very rough form, I'm just trying to create the different forms, I might use a much higher level of, say, something like 30 or 20 as I'm going through here, and I'm just kind of creating my form and really seeing what I want to do, because I don't know what I'm creating just yet. I'm just kind of sculpting, maybe this is a rock, maybe this is a ball of goo, or whatever it is that I'm sculpting. This could be anything. And so as with most sculpting systems, a good rule of thumb to approach when you're sculpting with dynamic topology is to sculpt the largest details first and just slowly get more and more detailed. If you just jump right into detail, you're probably going to run into some problems. But so the detail size, which you can adjust, by the way, with Shift D in the viewport. So this will adjust the detail size, where the larger the ring, the larger the detail size, the smaller the ring, and you can see it adjusting over here. The smaller the ring, the smaller the detail size is. So the smaller the ring, the smaller detail I'm able to add, and the higher resolution my mesh will become. So that just allows us to accommodate for the sculpt in much greater detail. Now, remember that I mentioned that this is in pixels. And so as I go in here, if I sculpt, I can zoom in here, and that's about the smallest detail I can create. If I zoom in further, I can add in detail there. Maybe I'll leave perspective mode so I can get a little closer. I can sculpt in, I can zoom in further. I can add in detail there. And so you can really go to almost infinite levels, because since this is in screen pixels, not in, based on the mesh size, it allows me to just continue zooming further and further until, I can really get as much detail as I wish. And so this is incredibly powerful because it just gives you a very good range of detail. Now, that was an obscenely small level of detail that is really unnecessary for any kind of practical solution, but it's nice to know that you have that ability to extend, for the detail that you're creating. So next, you'll also notice that regardless of the shading of my mesh, if I go into edit mode and I hit my mesh to shade smooth, it's nice and smooth shaded, so that's fine. But the moment that I enable dynamic topology, it becomes flat shaded. And I don't know the exact details for why this is. Just note that it is the shading within sculpt mode or within dynamic topology is different than the shading mode for the rest of it. So you can either work in flat shaded mode, or you can choose smooth shading right here. So if you enable smooth shading, then as you begin sculpting, it will continue to keep everything smooth shaded. Otherwise, it will go solid. Personally, I prefer to work in solid mode for the first while so that I can really see, the distribution, make sure I'm not getting, areas with really high distribution next to low distribution, etc. But that's largely personal preference. I know a lot of people prefer to work in smooth shaded mode. It may just be that I'm too much of a technical modeler and I really like seeing my mesh. Who knows? Regardless, there's a setting there if you want it. Next, we have this option called collapse short edges. So the collapse short edges is cool because what it does is it uses this detail size, and any edges that your brush comes across that are under this detail size will then be removed. So remember that I sculpted this little tiny spot right here. Well, if I decide that, man, I really don't want that, and instead, I would just like that to be much larger, if I sculpt on top of this, those edges are maintained, so they stay there. But this can cause problems at times because maybe, you'll find things like you've got a little pit like this where due to the density of the mesh, the sculpting is being interpreted slightly different in that area than the surrounding area. You notice that as I use the clay brush here, I'm trying to sculpt out that pit, but it still just leaves kind of a little bit of a bump there. And that's just kind of the way that it goes. When you have such a stark contrast in the resolution in these two areas, you're going to come up with differences there. And so that's fairly normal. But if you wanted to remove this, just like we can add in new geometry resolution very easily, we can also remove resolution. So if you just choose collapse short edges, any edge under this length will be dynamically removed under your brush. So if I just sculpt across this area, you can see it immediately removes all of those edges and leaves me with a uniform density in this area. So this is very, very valuable because it allows us to easily clean up the mesh as we go along. So this keeps it, a nice consistent resolution based on our zoom level as we're sculpting. Now, something to be aware of, as you probably noticed as I was sculpting here, is that if you've gone in and you've sculpted in some really nice little detail here, maybe we've got this little ring with a little divot here, and, let's just assume that that's a super awesome, cool detail. If I now zoom out and I sculpt over it, I'm going to remove that detail. So just be aware that with collapse short edges on, generally you're not going to want to use it if you've sculpted in a bunch of detail. So it's really good as kind of a, when you're in the conceptual process and you're kind of defining the forms and things like that, or if you're very carefully doing cleanup work and manipulating it, then it can be very, very valuable. But just be aware that it will also very quickly remove any detail that you have meticulously added in if you're at too high of a zoom or too far away from your model when you sculpt on it. Okay. The next thing is we have the optimize button. So with dynamic topology, since it has all kinds of things that it has to do underneath the surface, in order to calculate all this stuff, we have the ability to recalculate the sculpt BVH in order to improve performance. And I can't speak to the technical details of what this is doing, but if you begin noticing that sculpting is becoming slow or something like that, it may be a good idea just to click the optimize button real quick, and that will just slightly improve your performance. The next option that we have is the direction here, which actually relates to the Symmetrize button here. Now, The Symmetrize button, just real quick, is different than the symmetry option down here. So dynamic topology does work with the normal sculpt symmetry. So if we sculpt with the X symmetry or anything like that, we can sculpt across both sides of our model very, very easily. So if I sculpt down here, you can see it affects both sides, just like we can with regular sculpting. But the Symmetrize option is very, very cool, and it allows us to re-symmetrize our model based on any axis. So for example, if I decided that, you know what, I wanted to sculpt this, symmetrical, and I really like all of this over here, but then I realized, crap, I forgot to turn on the X symmetry. You really hate to just lose half of your model and have to redo it all again. Instead, what you can do is simply choose the directions here. So in this case, I like this over here. So this is the positive X direction. So I can choose positive X to negative X, and then simply click Symmetrize, and that will basically duplicate your model, flip it over here, and then rejoin them down the center. So now I have one consistent model that is symmetrical around those axes. Maybe I also like the negative Y to positive Y, so I can flip that, and there we go. Maybe I also like the positive Z to the negative Z, and flip that, and now I have a perfectly symmetrical model that then I can continue sculpting on. So now that I've done that, I might go back down here to the symmetry, enable X, Y, and Z, and now I can sculpt across all axes of my model, and I get a nice consistent result. Cool. So that's a really valuable feature, for doing all kinds of things. One thing you may also find through various, workflows is at times you will find that you'll have a discrepancy within your model. So you might be sculpting in here. I'm just going to turn these off for a moment. Or actually, we'll leave X on. You may be sculpting in here, and then you notice that there's kind of a weird, catch right at the center, or maybe you've got a weird point over here, and occasionally your symmetry will become just a little bit out of sync, where maybe this will have a couple of extra edges that this side doesn't have, and it's normal, while creating all these different edges through the system, it's bound that we're bound to run into errors from time to time. So this is where Symmetrize can come through. It can come through as kind of a cleanup utility, where if one side begins having a little bit of trouble that you're not able to resolve perfectly, then you can simply Symmetrize your mesh, and it will be good to go. Okay, so that is the actual settings within the dynamic topology. Now let's look at some of the brushes. So first of all, you should realize that within the brushes, not all of the brushes affect dynamic topology. So there are a couple of them, such as the grab brush, and I believe the nudge brush, and the thumb and twist brush. I don't believe any of these affect dynamic topology. Grab most definitely does not. So if we choose grab right now, and let's just scale our brush up, and then we'll just pull it up like this. Notice that we begin seeing some of that same stretching that we saw before with the regular multi-resolution system. So this is fairly normal, and it's just that certain brushes, just based on the way that they work, do not work with dynamic topology. But that's okay, as long as we realize that. So the grab brush, for example, does not. But what we can do, there is a brush that in Blender has been essentially worthless for a very long time, even though the brush itself was very, very cool, and that is the snake hook brush. So the snake hook brush, based on the icon, does exactly what it looks like. It allows us to grab a piece of a model, pull it out, and as we go, release little bits of it such that we can create long tendrils, we can create tentacles, we can create horns, we can create arms, any kind of appendage we can then create. But with the multi-resolution system, this didn't work because it just resulted in a lot of stretching. But now with dynamic topology, it does work, with one small caveat, in that for the snake hook brush to work well, you just need to enable collapse short edges. So if we enable collapse short edges, we go over here and we just draw out like this. You'll notice what happens. We can pull it out, and as it goes, it adds new geometry to account for those poles basically in those directions. So this is very, very cool. Allows us to do all kinds of cool things. Something like this. Zoom in a little further, get a little bit more detail, and we can create basically anything. So this is what then enables us to go in and sculpt anything from basically any form. So for example, let's just leave sculpt mode. Let's delete this, and I will add in a new object. I'll just add a new cube. I'll go back into sculpt mode. Notice that I've just set up a custom hotkey for this, which is Control-Alt-Tab. And now, let's go over here. Let's enable our dynamic topology, and I'm going to enable just X symmetry. Just go down here, and let's just pull that out. And my detail size, or my brush, was a little too small. And there we go, something like that. So what was previously a cube is definitely no longer a cube. This could be a tree branch, this could be pretty much anything. Maybe then using my clay brush, I'll just push down, I'll sculpt in a few forms, and begin starting to add more detail and more form in here as I go. Here we go. So here we go. So here's one example where you can see that this little divot right here only exists on the left side, but not the right side. I find that this commonly happens with collapsed short edges, as it's basically finding the edges to collapse. Sometimes things get a little bit out of sync. And so this is where the Symmetrize option, if we just go positive X to negative X, Symmetrize, that fixes that right away. So that way our mesh is completely identical and ensures that our surface behaves exactly the same. One other brush that also does not affect the dynamic topology is the smooth brush. So this is a brush, that we use constantly, which is the smooth brush right here. We can use it by holding down Shift. It does not add in additional geometry as we go. So just be aware of that. It's great for smoothing out the geometry that we have, but it won't add in any new geometry. So for example, if I wanted to sculpt the back side of this, to smooth that out, that line, what I would do, to get rid of the sharp edge, I might use the clay strips or clay brush, just draw over that real quick, which then adds in the geometry, and then I can simply go back over it with the smooth brush to then smooth out the geometry that I have just added. So this gives us a lot of flexibility to work with it. So the dynamic topology is very, very good for very kind of creative or organic sculpting of sorts. It can also be used for hard surface sculpting. It can be used for pretty much anything. And if you want some details and examples of how dynamic topology can really be used in a complete workflow, I do encourage you to check out our couple of series from Kent Trammell, where he has used dynamic topology to his advantage to create everything from a hard surface weapon, which is one of the series we just released, and then also his creature modeling for production DVD, which is available from the CG Cookies shop, also makes use of a dynamic topology workflow in order to sculpt an entire creature with really good detail for production. So both of those series, the creature modeling for production, which is available from the CG Cookie shop, and the hard surface weapon sculpting, which is available as part of the citizen membership, both cover dynamic topology in really good detail and actually how to apply it within an existing workflow to give you a complete sculpting system to really allow you to sculpt, whatever it is that you want to sculpt. And one of the benefits of both of those series, just to kind of promote our work for a moment, is both of them look at how to not only use dynamic topology in a sculpting environment, kind of like what I'm doing right now, but it looks at how to use dynamic topology alongside existing workflows. So how to use it along with a multi-resolution sculpting workflow, how to use it, in a production workflow where you begin retopologizing everything and going through each of the different steps of that workflow. So if sculpting is something that you enjoy, if dynamic topology is something you think you would like, then I definitely encourage you to check out both of those and or one or the other, because it really is a lot of really great info that, particularly with Kent's work and his production experience, is really invaluable if that is something that you're interested in doing. So I definitely encourage you to check those out. So here I'm just doing a little bit of a demonstration of kind of how I sculpt, going through a kind of a fluid workflow of sorts. So this is just purely made up. It's just from my head, just kind of sculpting in this head of sorts. And there's no reference. I'm just kind of using the dynamic topology system to allow me to really interactively and on the fly adjust the shape of my model, adjust the forms, and really have a lot of control over what it is that I'm doing, what it is that I'm creating, rather than being limited to the initial base mesh that I start with, like you would be in a multi-resolution system. And to me, this is really the benefit of the dynamic topology, because it does give you that flexibility that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily have. Now, just keep in mind that with that additional flexibility do come some limitations. Namely, if I wanted to animate this model, I really would not be able to. With this resolution of a mesh, with a mesh that is all triangulated, you really cannot animate something like this with any kind of structure or control. And so that is where you then need to go through the retopology process, which again, I'll promote some of our citizen work, and along with the the creature modeling series by Kent Trammell again, is when you have a sculpt like this, you will then need to go in and retopologize it. So earlier I mentioned that dynamic topology is really good for kind of conceptual sculpting. And I mean that literally because it's really good for coming up with designs and kind of seeing what you want to do with your character. But soon as you're ready to take that character or creature or form, whatever it is that you're sculpting, soon as you're ready to take that into an actual production, whether that is a game, a animation, or whatever it is, soon as you're ready to work with that further, you're going to need to retopologize it to give yourself a mesh that you have the ability to actually work with. So if you're not familiar with retopology, I did just release a series on hard surface weapon retopology in Blender. Now, it specifically looks at hard surface forms, but it can also be applied in many ways to organic forms. If you're doing organic, I would again also recommend checking out Kent Trammell's creature modeling for production, because it goes through the entire sculpting process and then goes through the entire retopology process to give yourself a finished model that you can really work with and really do pretty much anything with. So if those are, what you want to do, then that's kind of the workflow that you need to look at. So in this case, this is just a very, very quick sketch on the fly while I'm teaching. So there's obviously a lot of things wrong with it. But this is what I would do: is I would go in, I would sculpt this, then go through, once I really like the design, I like the details, I'll go through and retopologize it to give me a animation or just render ready model that I can actually work with to then give me a final model. And oftentimes you'll then take that final model to do a detail pass on, where you will go in and, using the multi-resolution system, you may go in and sculpt an additional level of detail on top of it for the final effect that you can then bake out either via normal maps or any other system for your final model to then render in your film, in your game, whatever it is that you're working on to complete the effect. So there you have it. That is dynamic topology sculpting. Very, very powerful system within Blender that gives us a lot of flexibility, and is bound to continue seeing more and more improvements as it goes along. It's been introduced just a couple versions back, but is already really kind of redefining the workflow of a lot of us within the sculpting world, particularly because it gives us the flexibility that we just didn't have with the previous system using the multi-resolution system. Like I've mentioned a couple of times now, I believe the multi-resolution system is very, very good for creating predefined designs or for accenting the design on an existing model. But the moment that you need to go in and do some conceptual sculpting, sculpt something from scratch, sculpt something that doesn't actually exist in any form, not just as a model or as a design, but at all, then it starts to fall a little flat. And this is where dynamic topology comes in and really kind of helps pick up that slack and give us the freedom that we really want. It brings the digital sculpting much more to a clay-like system than really ever before. And so as artists, it's a very, very cool system that personally I really, really like, because it gives me that control and the flexibility that I just haven't had in the past. And so I can say for sure that it has definitely kind of redefined my workflow and the way that I create my models in Blender.